Mr. President, I'm here for the 67th time to urge my colleagues to wake up to the growing threat of climate change, and today I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Senator Nelson of Florida, who is a true leader in this fight. I'd like to ask unanimous consent that we be able to engage in a colloquy for the next, say, 25 minutes.
Without objection.
Mr. President, Florida is about 1,000 miles from Rhode Island, and it is, slightly larger than my home state? But Florida and Rhode Island have a great deal in common, like a beautiful coastline, an economy and way of life that is tied to the sea, and as a result, risk from the ocean in a changing climate. On my recent trip down the southeast coast, I spent 2 days in Florida and heard firsthand about the unprecedented changes taking place there. Like the folks I met in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, Floridians are worried about the coastal communities that they love. They're getting serious about protecting their homes and their livelihoods, and they want their representatives in Congress to get serious too. Senator Nelson hears them. He recently took the Senate Commerce Committee to Miami Beach Town Hall to examine the dangers posed by rising seas. Here's what the Miami Herald said about his effort. I'll quote the editorial. South Florida owes Senator Nelson its thanks for shining a bright light on this issue. Everyone, from local residents to elected officials, should follow his lead, turning awareness of this major environmental issue into action. It is critical, they said, to saving our region. Senator Nelson and I also had a press conference at the Jacksonville Friendship Fountain with Representative Corrine Brown to highlight these serious implications of climate change. So I'm grateful to Senator Nelson for bringing his passion and his expertise on this issue to the floor today.
And Mr. President, I want to thank my dear personal friend, the senator from Rhode Island, for his kind comments, but especially thank him for his passion and his leadership on this issue. There are parts of America that it is time to wake up, and especially one part of that is the state of Florida. We have, because of the nature of our state being a peninsula that sticks down into water surrounding it on most sides, therefore you would not be surprised that we have by far the longest coastline of any state, save for Alaska. And when it comes to beaches, the state of Florida by far has more beaches than any other state. But because we have so much exposure to the oceans, the Atlantic on the east, the Gulf of Mexico on the west, we are particularly subject to climate change that the earth is heating up. Now, why is the earth heating up? Well, there is the effect known as the greenhouse effect. And what this is, if you put certain gases into the atmosphere that are as a result of man-made efforts, so when we burn things like oil and coal and we don't scrub out a lot of the stuff, it goes into the atmosphere. Well, one of the things that goes into the atmosphere is carbon dioxide. And what carbon dioxide does is it goes up into the upper atmosphere and it forms this greenhouse effect by creating an invisible shield that what happens when the sun rays come and strike the earth at daylight, those rays then reflect off the earth's surface, and under normal times, they bounce back out and radiate back into space. but not if you have a lot of gases up at the very beginning of space at the top of the atmosphere, like carbon dioxide. And when the Earth's surface radiates the sun's heat, it goes back up as if it wants to go out into space, and it's trapped. And what happens is the entire atmosphere of the Earth then contains that heat, and slowly over time, it builds up the temperature. Now, when you look at a globe, what do you see mostly? You don't see land, you see water. And so what happens is that most of that heating up of the Earth's atmosphere is absorbed into the temperature of the ocean. Because of the rise of the ocean temperature and the temperature of the air, what starts to happen? What's happening up toward the northern climes as well as the southern climes. Have you heard the report in the last couple of days about big chunks of Antarctica are now falling off of Antarctica? Have you heard about how all of the glaciers on top of Greenland, which used to be nothing but one big glacier, are now falling off into the sea, thus causing the sea rise? Now, I want to flip it back to the senator from Rhode Island with this comment. In the hearing that we had of the Commerce Subcommittee in Miami Beach, I chose Miami Beach. Why? Because it's ground zero. At high tide, they're already having flooding in the streets of Miami Beach. At a seasonally high tide that they expect coming up in October of this year, they expect constant flooding. And as a result, we had the mayor of Miami Beach tell us about the efforts of them trying to redo the infrastructure to get rid of the water when high tides come in. What we also had testify was a scientist at NASA, a fellow who is a 4-time space flyer. He left the astronaut office. He's back at the Goddard Space Flight Center in Maryland. He is a scientist, and what he testified to us was not forecast, not projections. He testified to us measurements of sea level rise over the last 50 years. And for Florida, the sea level rise, as measured by NASA, these are indisputable measurements, is 5 to 8 inches. His projections were, in another 20 to 30 years, a foot rise, 12 inches more, and by the end of the decade, 2 to 3 feet rise. I hasten to add, 75% of Florida's 20 million population lives on the coast. Can you imagine what a 2 to 3 foot rise on Florida would be? It would inundate unbelievable amounts of the urban community of our state of Florida. So the question is, are we going to do something about it? I want to flip it back to the senator from Rhode Island.
On my trip through Senator Nelson's state, the Army Corps of Engineer officials in Jacksonville gave me some pretty dire warnings about what the sea level rise portends for Florida, both the punch from storms that will bring higher seas ashore and the steady encroachment of salt water. This, as the senator will recognize, is a scene from western Boynton Beach after Tropical Storm Isaac in 2012. And I don't know if you can see it if you're watching, but this sign says no wake zone. The family put up a no wake zone sign in their front yard for cars going by, not to put wakes up to create more damage. The Corps also showed me what 2 feet of sea level rise would do to Everglades National Park. I went down to Everglades later on, but this is what it would look like. You can see all the green in the Everglades here and all the development up here. Basically, add 60 centimeters of sea level rise, 2 feet, and that's all ocean again. That's a pretty serious change. The Southeast Florida Regional Climate Compact, which is that bipartisan coalition of 4 South Florida counties, predicts that waters around Southeast Florida could surge up to 2 feet in less than 50 years. So that's a preview of coming attractions, Everglades underwater. What was interesting is that the local officials, both Republicans and Democrats, were working together on this. The division that exists in this body doesn't exist down there. Mayor Sylvia Murphy of Monroe County is a Republican. Former Mayor Kristen Jacobs of Broward County is a Democrat. They both know that flooding and access to drinking water are not partisan issues in the way that they divide us here. Here are a couple more examples from my visit. This is Castillo San Marcos, which Senator Nelson will recognize as being in St. Augustine. It's a famous ancient fort, very beautiful, and it sits along the water there. And if you add 3 feet of sea level rise, it turns from being part of the coast to being its own tiny little peninsula surrounded by flooding. It's the oldest masonry fort in the United States. And this is what Fort Matanzas would look like. This is a little fort built by Spanish colonists in 1742. It's right here on this inlet. And if you add 3 feet of sea level rise, suddenly it's in the water. It has nothing to stand on. As it is, they have built a wall to protect it from the sea level rise that's already happened, and from time to time the high tides lap over that wall. You said that there's an enormous amount of harm here that could happen to people. One of the scientists that I met in Florida said it this way, very simply. He said, if we don't do something about this, people are going to get hurt, and it's going to cost a lot of money. And that's true. One topic I'd like to discuss is the question of how the seawater will affect the freshwater supply of Florida. And Senator Nelson is an expert on the geology of Florida and why it's different than my rocky New England coast, and I'll yield back to him to discuss the limestone bedrock problem.
Mr. President, you would naturally ask the question, well, could we solve this problem in the United States like the Dutch have solved a lot of the coastal areas of the Netherlands by building up dikes? A lot of their land is actually below the level of sea level. You can't do that in a place like Florida, because the substrate underneath the surface soil is a porous limestone, much like Swiss cheese, so that if you try to put up a dike, it's not going to hold any water back, because the pressure of the water as it rises is merely going to go underneath the dike into the porous limestone, which is the source under the surface of Florida of a lot of Florida's drinking water, because that water in that honeycomb limestone is fresh. And what happens on sea level rise? More water, higher water, more pressure. The pressure then starts to push underneath the surface as well as over the surface of the land, and that causes the intrusion of salt water into the fresh water drinking supply. Another consequence of this is because Florida is so low, believe it or not, Mr. President, our highest point is at a point right near the Alabama-Florida line. It's actually 356 feet high. But when you get into portions of South Florida, it's very low. So obviously, sea level rise is going to cover a lot of land. But another consequence is that a lot of flood control is now regulated by gravity. You go from a higher position of flood and you flow by gravity through canals to a lower position of the sea level. When the sea level rises, now that water during floods, hurricane, rainstorm, whatever, can't flow. The only way to correct that is to install very expensive pumping equipment. And finally, in this segment of an exchange with the senator from Rhode Island, I would say that what's another consequence of the temperature of the oceans rising. Remember the greenhouse effect? Most of that heat is absorbed in the oceans. What is the fuel for a cyclone in the northern hemisphere called hurricane that goes counterclockwise? What is the fuel for it? It is the temperature of the water. Hurricanes in the northern hemisphere go counterclockwise. Hurricanes in the southern hemisphere go clockwise. What happens to the intensity of the hurricane? It goes up as the waters get hotter. That's why usually as the hurricanes are forming into these massive storms over the South Atlantic and the Caribbean, they start going north, they start to dissipate. Because the waters are cooler, it doesn't provide the fuel for the ferocity of the hurricane. Likewise, higher water temperatures, more frequency of hurricanes. Now, in our state, we live in a peninsula that sticks down into the middle of Hurricane Highway. It's a way of life. We understand that, and we've handled it pretty well, especially after the disaster of 1992, the monster hurricane, Hurricane Andrew. Our building codes are up and so forth. But you can't withstand a lot of Hurricane Andrews, which part of that was considered to be a Category 5, something in excess of 160-mile-an-hour winds. You know what 160-mile-an-hour tornadoes do to a small, confined, tight-knit cyclone-type activity. Imagine what those wind speeds do in a massive hurricane covering hundreds of miles. And now you start to see then the effects. An insurance industry cannot withstand insuring structures that are going to sustain that kind of damage. What's going to happen to the cost of insurance? It's going to go through the roof. What's going to happen to the cost of flood insurance that we have been through so agonized here in the federal flood insurance program? What's going to happen to the actual structures and the people who not only are subject to being flooded because of the rise of sea level, but of having their whole dwellings and city torn up like Hurricane Andrew did to downtown Homestead, a relatively small population of Florida, and absolutely tore it up. That's what we're facing unless we do something about climate change. And the first thing that we've got to do is we've got to stop this denial that it's not real. The scientists are telling it's real. The NASA astronaut scientist says it's measurements. They're flooding in Miami Beach. The local governments have banded together in southeastern Florida to try to get ahead of it. Why can't we get some of the senators here who, because it's not politically correct in their politics, to recognize what the truth is, so that we can start planning for this, not as a protection, but to plan for the protection of planet Earth and see if we can stop some of the causes of the climate change. And then once we do it, in the nation that stands as the role model to the rest of the countries, we're going to have to get them to do it too. Otherwise, you're going to see what has just happened in the last couple of days. Large chunks of Antarctica are beyond saving, and the consequences are grave. I really appreciate the leadership of my friend from Rhode Island and Senator Boxer of California. You all have been the ones that have been at the point of the spear. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Senator, and your leadership is really remarkable. Here's another example from my tour. This is Broward County. If people say it's not real, ask the owner of this house. For sale sign. Good luck selling that house with the ocean up through it. That was 2010. Another Broward County photograph. Your Commissioner, Kristen Jacobs, who was the mayor during this time, gave me these pictures. Again, this is tide. Look at the sky. It's a beautiful day. This isn't rain. This is tide flooding in. And what it does to the cars, it's a mess. And as Senator Nelson described, because Florida is this limestone kind of hard sponge, what keeps the salt water out is the pressure of the fresh water holding it at bay. There's no wall, there's no structure that keeps the water, salt, and fresh balance. It's a hydraulic system. And what they've done is they've built these canals, a very complex system of canals, where they've raised the water so that they have pressure so that they can push it back. Well, as the sea level comes up, they're losing that fight. And so here's a line through Broward County of how far the salt water has already intruded into the water supply. If you drill wells on this side of the red line, your water's no good. And all these wells, the little green spots all over here, all these water areas, they're in the way because this line is moving. And as the Army Corps engineer in Jacksonville said, Florida is in a box because as the sea level rises, the way you keep the fresh water available to people is by raising the fresh water. And that keeps what the engineers call the hydraulic head that pushes the seawater back and allows you to maintain fresh water for drinking and other purposes, for agriculture, for Florida oranges and grapefruits and all the things we count on. Well, if what you're worried about is flooding, you could only raise the freshwater head so far because you raise it enough, and what have you got? You got freshwater flooding. And there's no way out of that conundrum. There is no way out of that conundrum for Florida. And he said, whether it happens in 100 years or whether it happens after the next bad hurricane, that's what's going to happen. And that's a terrible predicament. And it's not going to get better by pretending it's not real. It's not going to get better by denying it. And if you go offshore, you get to the problem of acidification, which happens from the carbon. This is not a theory. People say climate change is a theory. No. The acidification of the ocean from heightened carbon dioxide is something you can do in a lab. It is a scientific fact. It is a law of chemistry. So it happens, and what happens is that it's really starting to hit the reefs and the fisheries as the ocean warms and turns more acid. Mayor Murphy is the mayor of Monroe County. I met her in Key Largo, which is one of the famous world destinations. And I said, what is acidification and warming? What's that doing to your reefs? And she said, well, the reefs are still beautiful unless you'd been out to see them 10, 15 years ago. The reefs are still beautiful unless you'd been out to see them 10, 15 years ago. People see the change. I met with the Snook and Game Fish Foundation in Florida and marine industry folks, and they're concerned about what's happening there. And in fact, the problem goes all the way up the coast. When I came down through North Carolina, South Carolina, the fishermen there told me that they're starting to catch snook off the Carolinas. I mean, it's one thing when we're catching grouper and tarpon up in Rhode Island, but what they're seeing in the South Atlantic coast is the same thing that a Rhode Island fisherman said to me about the ocean off our coast. He said, Sheldon, it's getting weird out there. We're catching fish our fathers never saw in their nets in their lives. And so when a snook comes up on a line off the Carolinas, that's a sign that something is really dramatically changing. And these reefs are changing as well. Last story, Rhode Islander, Mike Shirley, works at the Guantanamo Matanzas. How'd I do, Senator Nelson? Guantanamo Matanzas National Estuary and Research Reserve. He moved up there, that's just outside of St. Augustine. He moved up there from South Florida. He moved up 7 years ago. When he got up there, he said, you know, one thing was noticeable? There are no mangroves. South Florida is covered in mangrove, but there weren't any here. Now, 7 years later, the place is covered in mangrove. All that habitat migrating northward as the oceans and the water warms, and it's changing things. And he said one other thing. He said, you know what we got to look out for? There's going to be another migration north. It's going to be the people leaving flooded South Florida who can't get fresh water, whose homes are flooded, who can't deal with their car going hubcap deep in salt water every high tide. They're going to be moving up. It's not just the people from the cold north coming down to Florida. Now the people from the flooding south, he worries, are going to be coming north again. And I'll say one last thing. The mayors were terrific. Sylvia Murphy, the mayor in Monroe County, is putting climate and energy policy at the very forefront of her 20-year growth plan for Monroe County. Mayor Philip Levine of Miami Beach is hard at work. He says, sea level rise is our reality in Miami Beach. We are past the point of debating the existence of climate change. We're now focusing on adapting to current and future threats. Mayor Levine is pushing a $400 million plan to try to make the city's drainage system more resilient in the face of rising tides. From Mayor Joe Riley in Charleston, to Mayor Edna Jackson in Savannah, to Mayor Alvin Brown in Jacksonville, to the mayors in South Florida I mentioned, council members, mayors from Pinecrest, South Miami, Surfside, Miami Shores, Cutler Bay, Palmetto Bay, the Seminole tribe. The local officials are all serious about tackling climate change. It's real. They see it in their neighborhoods, they see it in their districts, they see it in their towns. And they're away from this poisonous place where the polluters control what people are allowed to think and see and do something about. We have got to start listening to the American people. We have got to start listening to the mayors who inhabit real life and not the political fantasy in this Senate. We have got to start dealing with this. Lee Thomas Lee Thomas worked for President Ronald Reagan. He was a member of the Reagan cabinet. He ran the Environmental Protection Agency for Ronald Reagan. Last week, he wrote an op-ed that I know the senator saw in the Tampa Bay Times, urging Florida's leaders to wake up to the changes taking place in the Sunshine State. Here's what he said: whether Democrat or Republican, Florida residents cannot afford to ignore the evidence of climate change. That's a Reagan official saying that. Come on, Republican mayors, Reagan officials, at some point we have to wake up. This is real. Just last year, Thomas joined all the other former Republican EPA heads, 4 of them, and they wrote this: the costs of inaction are undeniable. The lines of scientific evidence grow only stronger and more numerous, and the window of time remaining to act is growing smaller. Delay could mean that warming becomes locked in. A market-based approach, they say, like a carbon tax, would be the best path to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And Bob Samuelson just said the same thing in his editorial over the weekend. And I'll say that the citizens of Florida and the people of the United States are very fortunate to have a senator like Bill Nelson, who is aware of this problem, who's fighting hard to solve it, who's listening to his mayors, Republican and Democrat alike, who are telling him what is happening in their home state, and who is willing to bring the Commerce Committee of the United States Senate down to Miami Beach Town Hall to make sure that everybody understands what is going on. He helped bring that message back to Washington, and it was a terrific thing. So we will continue working together to get this body to wake up out of its polluter-induced slumber and face the realities that people all across this country are seeing in their daily lives. It is indeed, Mr. President, time to wake up, and I yield the floor to any final comments that the senator may wish to make.
The senator from Rhode Island has stated in one of the more eloquent fashions details about my state of Florida, because he was so passionate about the subject and so unselfish that he wanted to start in other states, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and several places on the east coast of Florida. It is extraordinary. Mr. President, I would leave you with this thought. Every time I hear a senator like Senator Whitehouse speak about this subject, and every time I look at a picture of the planet like he has on the poster that says, "Time to wake up," my mind's eye goes back 28 years ago to the window of our spacecraft on the 24th flight of the space shuttle, 203 nautical miles above the Earth, circumnavigating the Earth at 17,500 miles an hour, complete a revolution of the Earth in 90 minutes. When you look back at our planet, which is so beautiful, so colorful, so alive, so creative, and yet you look at the rim of the Earth as it falls off into the deep blackness of space, there's a thin little blue band. And upon closer examination out the window, you can actually see the thin film of what sustains all of our life, the atmosphere. And then, with the naked eye, you can see points on the Earth where we are messing it up. You can see the color contrast of the destruction of the trees in the Amazon, upriver in the Amazon. You can see the result of cutting down all the trees on an island nation like Madagascar which fortunately has started planting trees in that last quarter century. And therefore, the result of that tree cutting both in this hemisphere as well, in the island nation of Haiti, is that when the rains come, there are no trees to hold the topsoil. And it all flows down the rivers and out the mouths of the rivers, and you can see it from space in the discoloration of the water. That is for miles and miles out into the brilliant blues of the ocean. And if we don't do what people like Senators Boxer and Whitehouse are saying and wake up to the reality of climate change and try to get ahead of it by changing policies that will stop the greenhouse effect or at least slow it down, then what we are going to have for future space flyers are going to look back at a planet and the coastline of those states that Senator Whitehouse visited, all being the southeastern United States. That coastline is not going to look the same. It's not going to be a distinct coastline with a white beach along it that outlines it from the blue waters of the Atlantic. It's going to be much different, and to the great detriment of the people who live there and call that home. Mr. President, I yield the floor.